The morning they gave Catherine Hayes the cave, the sky over the Allegheny Valley was the color of old pewter, and the leaves on the hillside oaks had already turned the deep rust red that meant Pennsylvania winter was not a
The
rumor anymore.
colors are
It was
beautiful
October
this
of
year.
1856,
They
and
are.
Catherine was 25
I'm
years
glad
old,
we can
and she
share
stood at the
this.
mouth of a hole in
Me
the
too.
ground with a
It
bundle of
means
clothes under one
everything.
arm and a cooking pot hanging
Ready?
from the other.
On
She
three.
understood with perfect
Ready.
clarity
One,
that the two
two,
people walking back
three.
down the hill
It's
had
heavy,
just
but
given
we're
her something
moving.
they fully
Almost
expected to
there.
kill her. She watched Henry Hayes's broad back until the tree line swallowed him. She watched Ruth Hayes's steel gray hair wound so tight against her skull, it pulled the skin at her temples into something resembling a permanent expression of disdain. Neither of them looked back. People who have made a decision they are certain
We've
about do not look
returned.
back.
Welcome
Catherine looked at the
home.
cave.
It
The
is
entrance was
good
wide,
to be
perhaps
back.
15 feet across, carved into the
Supper is
limestone face of the
nearly
hillside by
ready.
water that had been patient for thousands of years. The ceiling above the entrance rose to 10 feet, and the floor was packed clay, hard and smooth, and it was dry despite the dampness that hung in the October air outside. She stepped in 2 paces, then 3. The darkness swallowed her slowly the way cold water rises when you wade in from the shallows. She stopped, set down the pot, set down the bundle, and then she noticed the first thing that would save her life, though she did not know it yet. The cave was not cold, not warm, not comfortable by any measure a person accustomed to hearths and wool blankets would recognize, but not cold. There was a stillness to the air inside that had nothing to do with temperature dropping and everything to do with temperature simply not changing, like a held breath, like the inside of a church built from stone 3 centuries ago, where the walls had forgotten what seasons were. Catherine pressed her palm flat against the limestone. The rock was cool and absolutely dry and faintly, almost imperceptibly warmer than the October air outside. She stood there with her hand on the stone and a question forming in her mind that she could not yet answer. Why is it warm? She filed that question away in the part of her mind where her father had taught her to keep things that mattered. The part he had trained in the small schoolhouse near Rochester, where he taught reading and arithmetic to farmers' children, and his own daughter how to look at a problem until she saw its actual structure beneath the surface it presented. She walked back to the entrance and looked down the slope at the valley below, where a farmhouse sat behind a split rail fence, and smoke rose from its chimney in a thin, indifferent column. The farmhouse where Thomas Hayes had grown up. The farmhouse where Catherine had spent 6 months learning to be invisible. She did not go back down that hill, not that night. She gathered sticks from the brush near the cave mouth, found 2 stones that would strike a spark, and built a fire so small it was really just a suggestion of a fire a few fingers of flame at the entrance to the cave. She lay down on the clay floor with her coat pulled over her shoulders and the bundle of clothes as a pillow, and she listened to the wind move through the trees outside, and she let herself think about Thomas. Thomas Hayes had been 30 years old when he died, and he had been sick before Catherine ever met him, though nobody had told her that. She had understood it in the first instant she saw him on the dock in Philadelphia, when he walked toward her with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into the expression of a man trying to look healthier than he felt. He was thinner than his letters had suggested. His cheekbones cast shadows. When he lifted her traveling trunk into the wagon, he breathed hard afterward for longer than a man his age and size should have needed to. She had not said anything. She had learned from watching her mother that there are things a woman notices about a man and chooses to carry quietly, at least at first, because pointing them out too soon accomplishes nothing except making the man feel seen in ways he is not ready for. She had thought she would have time to know him properly. 6 months seemed like the beginning of something, not the whole of it, but Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1856, had ideas of its own about time. The fever came in late September and moved through Thomas the way fire moves through dry grass quickly and without negotiation. 12 days. Catherine sat beside him for all 12, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, spooning broth between his lips, when he could manage it, holding his hand through the nights when the fever spiked and he talked without knowing what he was saying. She learned more about him in those 12 days of delirium than in the 6 months before them. He talked about a horse he had loved when he was 8 years old. He called for his mother twice and then did not call for her again. He said Catherine's name on the ninth day clearly and without confusion and looked at her with eyes that knew exactly where they were. I'm sorry I didn't write more truthfully. She had pressed his hand and told him not to be sorry. He died on the 12th day in the gray hour before dawn, and Catherine sat with him in the silence after, and then she went downstairs to tell Henry and Ruth what they had both been bracing themselves to hear since the fever started. Ruth received the news with her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap, her mouth pressed into that thin line. Henry received it standing, looking out the window at the pre-dawn dark, and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was to ask whether Thomas had said anything in his last hours. Catherine said he had not. This was not entirely true, but some things belonged to the dead, and Thomas had not meant for his parents to hear what he said to her on the ninth day. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small white church at the bottom of the valley where Reverend George Whitmore stood at the pulpit and read the words he had read too many times over. Too many coffins in a voice that had learned to carry solemnity without carrying grief, because carrying grief for every person you bury will empty you long before your work is done. Catherine sat in the front pew in a black dress borrowed from a neighbor woman who was 2 inches taller and a generation older. Ruth sat one seat away from her, and that empty space between them was more eloquent than anything said at the service. Afterward in the churchyard, while the remaining warmth of September tried to convince people the cold was not coming, Margaret Finn appeared at Catherine's left elbow, the way bad news tends to appear without warning, and with a smile that had nothing behind it. Margaret Finn was 45 and the wife of the man who ran the grain cooperative and therefore considered herself to occupy a particular position of social authority in the valley. She wore a dress the color of a bruised plum and carried herself the way people carry themselves when they have decided that their judgment of other people constitutes a form of community service. You poor dear. She said it loudly enough for the 4 people nearest them to hear every word. Coming all the way from New York State, not knowing anyone, not knowing how things work here. The climate, the soil, the way illness spreads in these hollows. It must be so hard not knowing how to care for someone in a place so different from home. Catherine looked at her directly. Thomas received good care, Mrs. Finn. Of course he did. Margaret smiled and began to turn away. If the care had been good enough, he'd still be here. Catherine took 2 steps after her. Just 2, enough that Margaret stopped walking. Catherine kept her voice quiet, aimed only at the woman in front of her, not at the listening churchyard. Mrs. Finn, I understand what you are doing, and I understand that you will continue doing it, but you should know something before you invest too much in the project. She paused. I did not come across state lines to be managed by someone who has never left this valley, and I will not be leaving because you would prefer it. Margaret did not respond, but something shifted in her expression, moved from contempt to something more calculating, the way a chess player's face changes when they realize the piece they dismissed is still on the board. From across the churchyard, Reverend Whitmore watched this exchange. He was too far away to hear the words, but he was close enough to see that the younger woman had stepped toward the older one rather than away, and something in him made a note of that. 3 days after the funeral, Henry Hayes came to the door of the small bedroom where Catherine had been sleeping since Thomas died, the bedroom at the back of the hall, with the lowest ceiling and the window that faced north. She had understood from the first week that this room had been selected for her rather than offered to her, and she had accepted it without comment, because the hierarchy of a household that is not yours requires a kind of careful navigation that her mother had also tried to teach her, though with less success than the other lessons. Henry set 2 pieces of paper on the small table beside the door. He did not sit down. He stood with his hands at his sides and his beard trimmed square, and he explained the situation with the efficiency of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and saw no reason to soften it. The first paper was a property document. Thomas had died without a will. Under Pennsylvania law, the farm, the house, the livestock, the equipment, all remained with the Hayes family. Thomas had known this. He had never been prompted to make other arrangements. Henry left that last implication in the room without naming it, the way you leave a piece of furniture that has always been there. Catherine looked at the document. She looked at Henry's face. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a father who loved his son might have once in 20 years of watching that son grow into a man who wrote letters to a woman he wanted to build a life with, mentioned the value of a will. She did not say it because saying it would accomplish nothing except satisfying a feeling that did not deserve satisfaction. She looked at the second paper. 5 acres of hillside, mostly rock, with a cave that old Elijah Stone had once told Henry was good for storing root vegetables and not much else. This was her inheritance. This was Thomas's provision for her as interpreted by the people who controlled what Thomas's provisions would look like. Ruth spoke from just behind Henry's shoulder, and Catherine realized she'd been standing there the whole time without making a sound, which took more effort than it appeared. We'll give you until spring. If you can make something of it, it's yours. If you can't, we'll buy the land back at fair value. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make its meaning clear. Which is nothing, I understand. Henry picked up the papers and left. Ruth followed. Neither of them looked at her as they went, which was becoming a pattern Catherine noticed with the particular attention people give to patterns that tell them something important about the terrain they are navigating. She sat on the narrow bed for a while after they were gone. Then she packed her bundle, took her cooking pot, and walked up the hill. She had already spent one night in the cave. She knew something about it that Henry and Ruth did not know she knew. She knew it was not cold in the way they assumed it was cold. She knew that her hand against the limestone had felt something that required an explanation, and she was the kind of woman who could not leave a question unanswered when the answer might matter. She spent her second night on the clay floor and woke at 3 in the morning to silence in a cave that was warmer than it had any right to be, and the question was still there waiting for her when she opened her eyes. She went looking for old Elijah Stone the next morning. The path to his cabin was not a path so much as a series of suggestions left by decades of one man's feet moving through the same forest in the same direction. Catherine followed the broken branches and the slight depressions in the leaf litter and the line of least resistance through the trees until she came out in a small clearing where a cabin stood that looked less like something built and more like something that had grown there over many years and simply decided to stop growing when it reached the shape of a shelter. Elijah was sitting outside on a section of log, mending a trap with the focused patience of a man who has made peace with the pace at which careful work gets done. He was 83 years old and looked it the way very old trees look their age, not diminish it but concentrated, all the essential qualities refined down to something dense in particular. His beard was white and reached his chest. His clothes were patched so extensively they had become a kind of record of every winter he had survived. He did not look up when Catherine came into the clearing. "You're staying in the cave. How did you know?" "Because you have a question in your eyes that only comes from sleeping somewhere that has surprised you." Catherine sat down on a nearby rock and looked at him mending the trap. "It's warm. The cave warmer than it should be." "Warmer than you expected," Elijah corrected. "It is exactly as warm as it should be. 52 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a degree, every hour of every day, every month of every year." He set the trap down and looked at her for the first time. His eyes were bright and patient. "You know what that means?" "Tell me." "It means the earth doesn't know what month it is. It doesn't know about winter. It doesn't know about summer. At the depth of that cave, the ground has found its temperature, and it keeps it. The rock holds heat the way good iron holds heat. Slow to warm, slow to cool. You heat those walls and they'll give it back to you all night long, long after your fire is ash." He picked up the trap again and returned to his work, and Catherine understood that he was not finished, that this was simply how he spoke in pieces with space between them. The opening is too wide. 15 feet, the heat walks right out the door. You need a wall logs chinked with moss and clay, leaving yourself a door 6 feet wide. You need a fire outside that wall, not inside. Fire inside fills the cave with smoke before it fills it with warmth, and smoke will kill you before cold gets the chance. He paused. The fire goes just outside the entrance, positioned to push heat inward, and flat stones arranged in a curve to catch that heat and reflect it back the way a mirror works with light. Catherine listened to all of it and stored it in the same careful place where she had put the question the previous night. Then she said what was becoming obvious. You've lived in that cave 4 months, winter of 1816, when this cabin burned and I had nothing else to go to. He set the trap down again. I was warmer than I'd been in any structure I ever built, warmer than I deserved to be some nights. He looked at her steadily. My daughter died in the winter of 1832, 16 years old. We had a house, good walls, but we ran short on wood, and I didn't know about the caves then the way I should have. I learned too late what I should have learned earlier. The clearing was very quiet. Catherine did not offer him comfort because he was not looking for comfort. He was stating a fact that had made him who he was. I'll help you build the wall. Not because you've asked me to, because it's the right thing to do before I die. And at 83, a man starts thinking carefully about what he wants to finish before the accounting is due. He stood up his joints, complaining audibly about the decision, and reached back inside the cabin door for a second coat. Come back tomorrow morning. Bring that cooking pot. We'll start with the wall. Catherine walked back down through the forest, with the path making slightly more sense in both directions now. And when she reached the edge of the tree line and the hillside opened up below her, she saw the Hayes farmhouse in the middle distance with its smoke rising from the chimney. And she thought about Thomas lying in the ground 3 days' ride south. And she thought about Ruth and Henry in that house, deciding every night that they had done what was required and nothing more. And she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something more like the particular clarity that comes when you understand exactly where you stand and decide to stand there anyway. The work began the following morning. Elijah arrived at the cave entrance just after dawn, carrying the small axe he had sharpened the night before. He showed Catherine once how to read the grain of a log before splitting it, how to find the line of least resistance in the wood, the same way you find the current in a river, and then he stepped back and let her do it herself because he understood that a woman who was going to survive a Pennsylvania winter alone needed to own the knowledge in her hands, not just in her head. They worked mostly in silence. That suited them both. The wall went up in the first 2 weeks of October, and Catherine's hands bled on the third day, and on the seventh day, and again on the 11th, and each time she wrapped the cut in a strip torn from the hem of her oldest petticoat and kept working because the cold coming down from the mountains did not care about her hands, and neither did the calendar. Elijah came 3 times in the first week, arriving before the light was strong and staying until Catherine had the technique settled in her muscle memory. He did not climb the hill daily. He was 83, and his joints made their position clear on the subject of repeated ascents. Instead, he taught her in concentrated sessions, watching her split logs and stack them and pack the gaps with moss she gathered from the north side of the oak trees where it grew thickest. On the morning of the 9th day, Catherine was packing moss into a gap between 2 logs in the upper section of the wall when she saw it. Deep in the interior of the cave, where the light from the entrance thinned to almost nothing, something had been cut into the limestone. She brought a burning stick from the fire and held it close to the wall. 2 letters and a number, ES1816. She stood there looking at the carving for a long moment. Elijah Stone. 40 years ago in the winter, he had described to her the winter after his cabin burned. He had pressed a blade into the stone of this cave and left his mark, not because anyone would see it, but because some things need to be recorded even when there is no audience. She ran her thumb across the grooves in the limestone and felt the 40 years in them, the way you can feel the rings in old wood not by counting, but by pressing your palm against the grain and simply knowing. She did not tell Elijah about it that morning. She waited until the afternoon when the light was better and the wall was almost finished, and then she brought him back inside and held the burning stick near the carving without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same as always, unhurried and direct. I forgot I did that. Catherine did not believe this and understood it was not meant to be believed. Some admissions come dressed as other things. On the morning Catherine was expanding the small garden plot above the cave entrance, the sheltered corner where a natural overhang of rock cut the wind and the soil ran slightly deeper than the rest of the hillside she was working, a new section of ground with the short-handled mattock she had borrowed from Elijah, turning the earth to check its depth before deciding whether it was worth planting when the blade struck something that was not rock, something that gave a different sound, a duller, softer resistance. She dug around it carefully with her hands, a piece of cured leather folded and tied with cord that had dried to near brittleness wrapped around something flat. She brought it inside and unwrapped it in the better light. It was a hand-drawn map. The ink had bled and faded, but the shapes were still legible. A rough diagram of the hillside from above with the cave marked clearly, and from it a series of lines indicating passages and chambers she had not discovered, smaller openings in the rock that she had taken for simple cracks in the limestone. There were two marks she did not immediately understand, small circles with lines extending from them, and a notation beside each one that she had to bring the paper nearly to her nose to read. Water said the first, good in drought. Air said the second, keep clear. Warmth goes out if blocked. In the lower right corner, in the same careful hand, ES1820. Catherine sat on the stone floor of her cave and held the 40-year-old map in her two cut and bandaged hands, and felt something move through her that she could not easily name. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was closer to the feeling of being handed a letter that was written before you were born by someone who did not know you existed, who wrote it anyway because they understood that need does not wait for a specific recipient. She took the map to Elijah that afternoon. He was lying down when she arrived, which was new. In 3 weeks of occasional work, he had always been outside waiting when she came up the path, already wearing his coat, already thinking about the next task. Seeing him horizontal on the narrow rope bed with a blanket pulled to his chest rearranged something in Catherine's understanding of the situation she was in. She put the map in his hands. He looked at it without sitting up, turning it to catch the light from the small window. I put it there in the spring of 1820, after my daughter died that winter. I thought someone would need it, someone who would come to that hillside after I was gone and not know what I knew. He paused. I did not expect to still be here when they found it. You've been waiting 36 years. The earth is not in our hurry. I learned to match my pace to it. His breathing was audible in a way it had not been a week earlier. A slight unevenness at the bottom of each inhale, the sound of lungs that had spent too many winters in a mountain cabin and were beginning to present their bill. Catherine built up his fire before she left and came back the following morning and the morning after that, climbing to his cabin first before going to her own work, bringing broth she made from dried beans and whatever she could find on the hillside that was still edible in the cooling autumn. He let her do this without protest, which told her more about his condition than anything he said. By the end of the second week, the wall stood. The doorway was 6 feet wide and centered, and the small window opening to the left of it was covered with a piece of oiled paper Catherine had traded a morning's worth of mending for it at the dry goods store in the village, going in and out quickly, speaking to no one she did not need to speak to. The wall changed the cave the way a frame changes a painting. Suddenly, the thing inside it had edges and therefore meaning. Catherine stood in the entrance and looked in and understood for the first time in her body, rather than just her mind, that she was not preparing a place to survive. She was building a place to live. The distinction mattered. She held on to it. The fire she built outside the entrance on the first full evening with the wall in place performed exactly as Elijah had described. She added flat stones from the hillside arranged in a wide curve facing the doorway and she watched the heat move inward and felt the cave respond. The limestone warming under her hand by degrees slowly and then steadily, a reservoir filling. She slept that night without waking once to cold. On the fifth day after the wall was finished, Ben Carter came up the hill. He was 22, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of open face that makes a person's thoughts visible before they've decided whether to share them. He was carrying a cloth-covered basket that his mother had clearly packed because it contained the sorts of things mothers pack when they cannot in good conscience let a neighbor go hungry, but do not want to be seen participating in a controversy. He set the basket down at the cave entrance and looked at the work Catherine had already done. The logs she had stacked, the moss packed into the gaps. My mother sent food. I came because I wanted to see for myself. What did you want to see? He looked at her honestly. Whether you were actually going to try to live here, or whether this was just stubbornness that would pass in a week. Catherine took the basket and pulled back the cloth. Bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a jar of pickled beans. She looked up at Ben. Would you like some tea? I have dried mint from the hillside. They sat at the cave entrance while the tea brewed in the pot, and Ben looked at everything with the unguarded curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't interested. He asked her what the wall was for, and she explained. He asked her about the fire arrangement, and she explained that too. He nodded slowly, turning the information over in the way people do when something conflicts with what they assume they already knew. You can't live here, not cruel, just factual, the way someone states a thing they believe to be self-evident. Nobody lives in a cave. I'm going to live in this one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, accepting it the way a practical person accepts evidence that contradicts their theory, not enthusiastically, but without excessive argument. If you need wood or tools, I can help some. Not because anyone told me to, because it's the right thing. He meant it. Catherine believed he meant it, but 2 days later, he did not come back, and she understood the shape of what had happened without needing to be told. The valley was small. Henry Hayes supplied seed to most of the farms at the start of each planting season. Margaret Finn had ways of reminding people of arrangements that mattered, and none of those reminders needed to be explicit to be effective. Catherine did not blame Ben. She understood the geometry of his situation with complete clarity, because understanding the geometry of situations was something her father had taught her before she was 12 years old, standing in the small schoolhouse near Rochester, while she worked through arithmetic problems that turned out to be about more than numbers. She understood Ben Carter, and she stopped expecting anything from him, and she returned her full attention to the wall. She was gathering firewood on the afternoon she encountered Reverend Whitmore on the road between the cave and the village. He was walking alone, which was unusual for a man whose profession required him to be surrounded by the needs of others, and he stopped when he saw her coming down the hill. He was 55, with the careful face of a man who has spent decades listening to people in their worst moments and learned to keep his own reactions where they would not interfere with his usefulness. He looked at Catherine the way he had looked at her across the churchyard on the day of Thomas's funeral, with an attention that was measuring something she couldn't quite name. I hear you're staying. Yes, Henry Hayes has supported this church for 10 years. He said it without inflection, as a piece of information rather than a threat, and she appreciated the honesty of that. I want you to understand my position. I understand it. He looked at her for another moment. Ruth Hayes came to see me last week. She asked me to encourage you to find more suitable accommodations, to suggest that a widow living alone on a hillside sets an uncomfortable example for the community. And will you know? He said it quietly and without drama. I won't do that. He paused. But I want you to understand that my ability to help you openly is limited. Henry Hayes is not a man who forgets when someone crosses him, and I have a congregation to consider. He paused again, longer this time. What I can tell you is this: if you genuinely need something, come to me. Not as a parishioner, as a neighbor. I know this valley better than most people know it, and knowledge has its uses. It could have been an offer. It could have been a warning. Catherine suspected it was both, and she filed it in the same careful place she kept everything that might matter later. She went back up the hill as the light was fading, and she rebuilt the fire at the entrance to her finished wall, and she sat inside the cave where the warmth had begun to accumulate in the stone around her, and she felt it gift back the day's collected heat in a slow, steady radiance that did not care who she was or where she came from or whose daughter-in-law she had been for 6 months before she stopped being anyone's anything except her own. The fire outside burned down to coals. The cave stayed warm. She lay down on the flat stones she had arranged across the clay floor and pulled her coat over herself and looked at the darkness above her and thought about all the people below in the valley who were waiting in their various ways for her to fail. Then she closed her eyes and slept. Walking home from Elijah's cabin one evening in the third week of October, with the temperature dropping fast and the first real bite of what was coming in the air, Catherine stopped on the path and stood still for a moment in the gathering dark. The valley below her was lit by the yellow glow from farmhouse windows, small squares of warmth in the blue-gray dusk. Elijah's light behind her, the cave ahead. She thought, if Elijah does not make it through this winter, there will be no one in this valley who knows me as anything other than what Ruth and Henry and Margaret Finn have decided I am. The thought arrived with a force she had not anticipated, not as self-pity, but as something more precise and therefore more difficult to manage. She was not afraid of being alone in the physical sense. She had already demonstrated to herself that she could manage the physical facts of solitude. What she had not fully reckoned with was the possibility of being erased, of existing in this valley, in the precise shape that other people's stories had made for her, with no one left who knew the difference between that shape and the actual one. She stood in the dark and let the feeling be what it was. Then she walked back to the cave and added wood to the fire and went to sleep, because standing in the dark does not solve what the dark contains. Ben Carter came up the hill in late October without announcement and without explanation, carrying nothing, which meant he had come on his own account rather than on someone else's errand. Catherine was outside splitting wood when she heard him on the slope and watched him come over the rise with his hands in his pockets and his eyes taking in the finished wall, the hearthstones, the orderly stack of firewood, with the same expression he had had the first time, surprised in a way he hadn't quite prepared himself for. He stood looking at the wall for a moment. "You finished it 3 weeks ago." He nodded, then he walked to the doorway and looked in. He stepped inside, stood on the stone floor, and was quiet for a long time. Catherine watched him from the entrance, waiting. "It's warmer than outside." "Yes." "Considerably warmer." "Yes." He came back out and looked at the hearthstones and then back at the cave and then at her. And something in his face had shifted from surprise to something more complicated. He was 22 years old and he was working something out in real time. "I didn't come back after the first time. You know why, I know why, and it wasn't right." He said it plainly, without drama, a factual assessment of his own behavior that cost him something to make. "Margaret Finn didn't threaten us directly, but the seat arrangement matters to my family. And she has ways of reminding people of that without saying it out loud. I know how it works. It still wasn't right." He looked at her. "I'm saying that because it's true, not because I'm about to do anything different. My family needs those seeds in the spring." He paused. "But I stopped repeating what people say about you. I can do that much." Catherine looked at him for a moment. He was telling the truth about the limits of what he was able to offer, which was a more useful thing than a promise he could not keep. "That's something." He nodded once and went back down the hill, and Catherine returned to her splitting, and the wood pile grew by another 6 logs before the light failed. The following week, Margaret Finn arrived. She did not come alone. She brought 2 women from the valley with her, wives of neighboring farmers, chosen with the same instinct a person uses when they want witnesses to something they intend to characterize afterward. They came up the hill in a group, their skirts catching on the dry brush, Margaret in front, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone executing a plan. Catherine was sitting in the cave entrance doing needlework when they appeared over the rise. She set the needlework down, but did not stand up. Margaret stopped a few feet from the entrance and looked at the wall at the hearth, at the orderly domesticity of what Catherine had made from the hole in the ground that was supposed to finish her. Her face went through several things quickly, none of which she allowed to settle into a readable expression. Well, you've made it into something. I've made it into a home. It's a cave. A well-organized cave is still a cave. A well-organized home is still a home. Would you like to come inside? Margaret did not move. But the two women behind her exchanged a glance, and then the younger one stepped forward, and after a moment the other followed. They came through the doorway and stood on the stone floor, and Catherine watched them look around, look up at the limestone ceiling, look at the quilts hung across the back section, look at the stored food in the natural niches of the rock. She watched them feel the temperature with their skin, the way warmth registers, before the mind has consciously noted it. She watched their faces do what faces do when reality contradicts expectation. The younger woman said something quiet to the other. Catherine did not hear the words, but she heard the tone, which was not mockery. When they came back out, Margaret was looking at them with an expression that required careful maintenance. She turned back to Catherine and said with the conviction of someone who needs the last word to remain manageable, "Winter will test it properly." A few warm nights in October proved nothing. Catherine did not answer. She picked up her needlework, and then while Margaret and her two witnesses were still watching, she turned and added two pieces of wood to the fire outside the entrance. The flame steadied and the warmth pushed inward, and the stone floor of the cave absorbed it with the patient indifference of something that has been doing this for a great deal longer than any of them had been alive. Margaret turned and walked back down the slope without another word. Catherine set her needlework down again and looked at the valley. She thought about what the winter would be, about what it would ask of her, and of the cave and of the decision she had made to stay. She thought about Elijah in his cabin with his uneven breath. She thought about the map he had left in the ground for 36 years for a person he did not know. She was still thinking about it when the first snow came. November came to the Allegheny Valley with the subtlety of a door slamming. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single afternoon and stayed there, and the wind that had been occasional in October became constant, a presence you planned around rather than ignored. Catherine woke on the first morning of the new month to find frost on the inside of the oiled paper covering her window. Outside the cave entrance, the world had gone colorless. The rust-red leaves that had clung to the oaks through October lay scattered across the hillside in brittle drifts, and the sky pressed down low and gray with the particular weight of weather that has not yet decided what it wants to do, but has already made clear it will not be pleasant. She built up the fire and felt the cave respond the way it always did, the limestone accepting heat and holding it with the patience of stone that has been doing this since before Pennsylvania had a name. The stores she had built were modest but sufficient: dried beans in a clay jar, pickled vegetables from what the garden had yielded before the frost took it, smoked fish she had traded for with a man who came through the valley twice a month selling from a cart, flour in a sealed tin, salt, a small sack of cornmeal. She had learned from her mother how to make a little go far, and she had learned from the past 3 months how to be careful about what careful meant. She climbed to Elijah's cabin that morning and found him sitting up, which was an improvement on the previous 2 days. His color was poor, but his eyes were clear, and he accepted the broth she brought without the resistance he had offered the week before when he was still trying to pretend his lungs were not presenting their accumulated bill. They sat in silence while he ate. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and looked at her with the directness of someone who has moved past the point where social softening serves any purpose. "I won't make it past winter." Catherine did not contradict him. She had been raised to understand that telling comfortable lies to dying people is a kindness to yourself, not to them. His breathing came harder now, a wet sound from deep in his chest. "Is there anything you need?" "Just what you're already doing." He looked toward the window where the gray light came in weak and diffuse. "Keep going up to that cave. Keep the knowledge I gave you. Pass it to someone else when the time comes." "I will." He nodded once satisfied. She returned to the cave and spent the afternoon splitting wood, building the stack higher against the wall where it would stay dry. The repetitive repetitive work gave her hands something to do while her mind processed what Elijah had said and what it meant for the shape of the winter ahead. The loneliness of losing him would not be the loneliness of being alone. It would be the loneliness of being seen only through other people's needs and judgments, of existing in a shape you did not make and could not correct, because the only people who might correct it were the same people who had made it. She split wood until the light failed and her arms shook with fatigue, and then she went inside and ate beans from the jar and lay down in bed and let herself think about her father. He had been dead for a year and a half, tuberculosis that came slow and stayed long, and took him in the spring of 1855 in the small house behind the schoolhouse where he had taught for 23 years. Catherine had sat with him the way she would later sit with Thomas, learning again that dying is mostly waiting, punctuated by small deteriorations that accumulate into something final. Her father had taught her to look at problems the way a carpenter looks at wood, finding the grain and working with it rather than against it. He had taught her that most people mistake the surface of a thing for its structure, and that the distance between those two is where wisdom lives. He had taught her that being right about something does not obligate the world to agree with you, but it does obligate you to act on what you know. She thought he would approve of the cave. He would ask detailed questions about the thermal properties of limestone and nod as she answered, and probably sketched the wall construction in the margins of whatever book he was reading. He would not say he was proud of her, because that was not how he expressed himself. But the questions would contain the pride, and she would know it. She fell asleep thinking about the schoolhouse in winter and the way her father had kept it warm with a small stove and careful attention to the draft. And when she woke in the morning, the cave was still 52 degrees and the world outside had decided what it wanted to do. It wanted to snow. Not the light, suggestive snow of early winter, but the serious, accumulating snow of weather that is committed to its position. Catherine stood at the entrance and watched it fall. In the gray dawn light, thick flakes that came down straight and steady and began immediately to erase the landscape she had been learning for 3 months. By midday, there were 4 inches on the ground. By evening, there were 8. She brought in extra wood and stacked it near the back wall where it would stay completely dry. She checked the window covering and reinforced it with an additional layer of cloth. She filled the cooking pot with snow and set it near the fire to melt, and then filled every container she had with water, because snow was not guaranteed and thirst was not negotiable. The snow fell for 2 days without pause. When it finally stopped on the morning of the third day, the world outside the cave entrance was transformed into something unfamiliar and absolute. 12 inches of white covering everything that had been the hillside, the paths Catherine had been learning, erased the distinction between ground and fallen log and rock outcropping lost under the uniform surface. She put on every layer she owned and stepped out into it. The cold was immediate and specific, a physical presence that found every gap in her clothing and moved through it with the directional purpose of water finding cracks. Her breath came in plumes. Her hands inside their wool gloves went numb by the time she had walked 20 feet from the cave entrance. She made her way up to Elijah's cabin, following the line she thought the path should take, and correcting when the terrain under the snow told her she had guessed wrong. It took twice as long as it should have, and when she finally came into the clearing, she saw that no smoke was rising from the chimney. She found him in his bed. Under every blanket, he owned his breathing so shallow she had to put her hand on his chest to confirm it was happening at all. She got the fire going and heated broth and managed to get some of it into him, though most of it ran down his chin and soaked into his beard. His eyes opened once while she was there, and he looked at her without recognition and then closed them again, and she understood that whatever was happening inside him had moved past the point where outside intervention mattered. She stayed until the fire was built up strong enough to last the rest of the day, and then she went back down to the cave and sat inside in the warmth and felt the particular helplessness that comes from understanding that some deteriorations cannot be stopped, only witnessed. She spent the rest of November in the cave, going out only when necessary to gather more wood or check the drainage channel she had dug above the entrance to keep snowmelt from running inside. The store she had built held. The fire arrangement Elijah had taught her continued to work exactly as he had described. The cave stayed warm while the world outside moved deeper into winter. She saw no one. The valley below was visible on clear days as a collection of distant buildings with smoke rising from their chimneys, but no one came up the hill and Catherine did not go down. The isolation was complete, but not unwelcome. She had learned in the past 3 months that she did not mind her own company. And she had learned in the past 3 weeks that other people's company often came with conditions she was not interested in meeting. December arrived with more snow and temperatures that dropped low enough that the water she left outside overnight froze solid in its container. The cave became the only reality that mattered. The world outside was something she visited briefly to gather what she needed, and then retreated from, the way you might step out of a warm house to retrieve something from a shed, and then return to the warmth without lingering. She thought about Thomas during those weeks. Not constantly, but regularly, the way you think about a question that has not been fully answered. She thought about the letters he had written to her in the months before she came to Pennsylvania. Letters that had described the farm and the valley and his hopes for what they might build together, but had not described the cough that woke him at night or the weight he had been losing since spring. She did not hold it against him exactly. She understood the fear that must have driven that omission. The calculation that if he told the truth, she might not come, and if she did not come, he would die alone without even the possibility of the thing he wanted. But understanding did not erase the fact that he had made a choice that prioritized his need over her right to choose with accurate information. And that choice had consequences that extended beyond his death into her present circumstances. She thought about this not with bitterness, but with the kind of clear-eyed assessment her father had taught her to bring to situations that required understanding rather than judgment. On the morning of December 12th, Catherine woke to a silence that was different from the usual silence of snow. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify what had changed, and then realized the wind had stopped. She got up and looked out through the gap beside the window covering. The sky was clear, pale blue and depthless, and the sun was just coming up over the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the white hillside. The temperature inside the cave was 52 degrees. The temperature outside was probably 15 degrees colder than that, maybe 20. She could see her breath in the air near the entrance, where the cold crept in around the edges of the wall, but past the first few feet, the cave held its warmth the way Elijah had said it would. She built up the fire and ate cornmeal mush, and decided it was a good day to go down to the village for supplies. She had flour and salt enough for another 2 weeks, but not more than that, and waiting until she ran out completely was not a strategy her father would have approved of. The walk down took an hour through snow that was knee-deep in places and crushed into an easier surface in others where the wind had worked on it. The village was quiet, most people keeping to their houses in the cold, but the general store was open, and Catherine went in and bought what she needed and was back outside before anyone could do more than nod in acknowledgement. She was halfway back up the hill when she saw the smoke, not from her cave which she had left with the fire banked low, but from the Hayes farmhouse in the valley below. Except there was almost no smoke, just a thin thread rising from the chimney barely visible against the pale sky. She stopped and looked at it for a long moment. The Hayes farmhouse had a good chimney. She had seen it every day for 6 months, and the smoke had always risen in a proper column, gray and substantial. This was different. This was the smoke of a fire being kept small. She stood in the snow and felt the question form. How much wood did they have stacked when the snow came? She had noticed back in October that the wood rack on the south side of the house looked lower than it should have been. She had noticed it the way she noticed most things, without meaning to and without being able to stop, and she had filed it away as information that might or might not matter. Now it mattered, or it might matter. She did not know for certain. Henry and Ruth Hayes had lived in this valley for 30 years. They had survived 30 Pennsylvania winters. They almost certainly knew what they were doing, but the smoke was wrong. She stood into the cold and felt the pull of two incompatible obligations. They had given her the cave expecting it to kill her. They had made her invisible for 6 months. They had offered her nothing after Thomas died, except a piece of land they considered worthless, and a deadline that was meant to shame her into leaving. She owed them nothing by any reasonable accounting, but the smoke was wrong. She turned and kept walking up the hill toward the cave, and the thought followed her the whole way. The 13th of January came with a clear sky and a temperature that made the air hurt to breathe. Catherine woke in the dark before dawn to a stillness that was more than absence of wind. It was the stillness of the world holding itself in position, waiting for something. She lay on her stone bed under the wool blankets and listened to nothing and felt the pressure in her ears drop in a way that meant weather was coming even though the sky had been clear the night before. She got up and dressed and went outside. The stars were still visible, hard points of light in the black sky, but on the western horizon there was something that was not quite cloud and not quite darkness, a thickness to the air that suggested substance gathering. She had seen this before. Once in New York State when she was 14, and her father had stopped his lesson halfway through and told the children to go home immediately and take the shortest route. The storm had arrived 3 hours later and lasted 2 days, and when it was done, there were drifts higher than a man's head, and 2 families in the valley had lost their chimneys to the wind. She went up to Elijah's cabin, knowing what she would find. He was sitting up in bed looking out the window at the strange light, and when she came through the door, he turned and looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they had been in weeks. Today you prepare. Tomorrow the storm comes. How do you know I've seen this before? Twice. Once in 1843 and once in 1851. The air goes still and the pressure drops and the animals disappear, and then it comes all at once and it doesn't stop. How long? 3 days, maybe 4. He coughed, the wet sound deeper now. Make sure you have water inside and wood stacked where you can reach it without going out, and food enough that you don't have to cook over the fire if the wind makes it impossible. She left him there and half ran back to the cave and spent the next 6 hours in the most purposeful work she had done since October. Wood. She brought in every piece she had stacked outside and piled it along the back wall until there was barely room to move. Water. She filled the cooking pot and every jar and container twice from the spring and set them deep in the cave where the temperature would keep them from freezing. Food. She pulled the stores forward from the back niches so she could reach them without light if necessary. The door. She checked every gap in the wall and repacked the moss where it had settled. She cut a section of log and angled it against the inside of the door so the wind could not pull it open. By late afternoon, the preparations were finished. Catherine stood at the cave entrance and looked down at the valley. The Hayes farmhouse was visible a mile below its chimney, releasing that same thin thread of smoke into the motionless air. She stood there longer than she had planned to, looking at that chimney smoke, and felt the question that had been forming for weeks take its final shape. If the storm was as bad as Elijah believed, and if it came as fast as the sky suggested it would, the people in that farmhouse might not be prepared for what was going to happen. They had lived here for 30 years. They had survived Pennsylvania winters for 30 years. They were almost certainly fine. But the wood had looked low in October, and the smoke was thin now. And if they were not fine, if they were in the position she suspected they might be, and then 3 days of storm would leave them in a situation that might not be survivable. And she was the only person who would know. She went inside, she built up the fire, she braced the door, she lay down on her stone bed in the warmth and let herself think about what she did not want to think about. She did not want them to die. The certainty of it surprised her. It was not complicated by resentment or qualified by the history between them. It was simply true the way the temperature of limestone was simply true without sentiment or interpretation. If they died in that house because they had run short on wood and she had known they might be in trouble and had done nothing, she would carry that. Not because she owed them anything. Not because forgiveness required it, But because letting people die in a preventable situation when you have the knowledge and ability to prevent it is not made acceptable by the fact that they once wished you harm. She lay in the dark and felt the weight of that settle. The storm came at dawn on the 14th of January, 1857, and it did not come gradually. It came the way certain truths arrive all at once and without apology. Catherine opened the cave door to check the fire that first morning, and the wind took the door out of her hand and drove snow horizontally into her face with the force of something that had been building its fury all the way across the open plains before it found the Allegheny Mountains to spend it on. She got the door shut, her hands already numb from the 10 seconds of exposure. She did not try to open it again that day, or the next day, or the day after that. 3 days inside the cave while the world outside ceased to exist. On the first day, Catherine thought about Thomas. Not the Thomas of the last 12 days, but the Thomas of the letters, the man who had written to her about soil drainage and winter elevation and asked her whether she knew how to read the sky before a storm. She thought about the version of her life that had been possible before typhoid made it impossible, and she did not let herself stay there long because that kind of thinking is a door that opens only in one direction. On the second day, she thought about her father. She thought about the schoolhouse with its one window and its smell of chalk and old wood, and her father setting her arithmetic problems that were secretly lessons in something else entirely and how to look at a situation and identify its actual structure beneath the surface it presented. She thought he would approve of the cave. He would ask detailed questions about the wall construction and nod as she answered. He would not say he was proud of her because that was not how he expressed himself, but the questions would contain the pride and she would know it. On the third day, she thought about Henry and Ruth. She had not planned to. The thought arrived without invitation and stayed without permission. Two people in a farmhouse a mile below with a wood rack that had been low in October and a chimney emitting barely any smoke, which meant a fire kept small to conserve fuel, which meant people managing carefully because what they had was not enough. She thought about them for a long time. Uh, about what they had done, about what they had intended, about the fact that intention and consequence are not the same thing, and that allowing someone to die in a preventable situation is not made acceptable by the fact that they once wished you harm. She thought, I do not want them to die. And then she thought, I am the only one who can get to them. And then she thought, if I go and they are fine, I will have risked myself for nothing. And if I go and they are not fine, I will have risked myself for people who tried to kill me with this cave in the first place. And then she stopped thinking and simply knew what she was going to do. When the storm stopped on the morning of the fourth day, the silence fell over the mountain like something physical, a weight and a softness at the same time. Catherine waited an hour to be certain. Then she dressed in every layer she had, took the short-handled mattock from its place near the wall, pushed open the cave door against the packed snow behind it, and looked out at 8 feet of white covering everything that had been the world 3 days ago. She started down the hill toward the Hayes farmhouse. The snow came to her shoulders in the open sections. She drove the mattock handle down to gauge the depth before each step in places where she could not see the ground. The cold was the serious, purposeful cold of a storm that has finished its work and left the results for others to deal with. Her breath came in plumes. Her hands inside her gloves went numb by the time she reached the tree line, and then went past numb to a state she simply had to accept and work with. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes took 4 hours. 4 hours of driving the mattock down, testing the depth, taking a step, driving it down again. 4 hours of snow that sometimes held her weight and sometimes collapsed under her into hollows she could not see. 4 hours of cold that moved through her layers and settled into her core until she stopped being able to feel her feet entirely and had to watch them to make sure they were still doing what she told them to do. She knew before she reached the house that something was wrong with it. The chimney was not smoking at all. She drove the mattock through the snow, piled against the south door, and cleared enough to get her hand to the wood, and she knocked and she waited. And she heard from inside the slow and muffled sound of someone moving, who has been sitting very still for a very long time. The door opened inward, away from Catherine's hand, and Ruth Hayes stood in the gap with 3 blankets around her shoulders and her breath visible in the air inside her own house, which told Catherine everything she needed to know about how the last 3 days had gone for the people on the other side of that door. Ruth looked at her without speaking for a moment. Her face had shed its habitual architecture, the tight arrangement of features that communicated permanent judgment. What was underneath was older and more honest a face that had spent 72 hours being afraid and had run out of the energy required to hide it. Catherine. Just the name, nothing attached to it. I need you to come with me. Both of you. Right now. Ruth stepped back from the door and Catherine pushed through into the house. The cold inside was not as severe as the cold outside, but it was the cold of a space that had been losing heat steadily for a long time. A cold that had settled into the walls and the furniture and the floor and was no longer a temporary condition, but a fact of the room. The fireplace held a small heap of coals that had not been fed in hours. Beside the hearth, 3 chair legs were piled near the coal scuttle, the remains of what had been a Windsor chair that Catherine recognized from the corner of the parlor, where she had spent 6 months eating meals at the edge of other people's conversations. Henry was in the chair nearest the coals. He was sitting upright, which required effort she could see in his shoulders and his jaw, the effort of a man who has decided that certain postures are non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. He was wearing his coat over 2 sweaters, and his hands were wrapped in what appeared to be a pair of wool stockings. He looked up when Catherine came in, and she saw in his face what she had never seen there before and had not expected to see even now. He was frightened, not of her, of what the last 3 days had shown him about the limits of what 30 years of competence and self-sufficiency could actually guarantee. The chimney's blocked. His voice was steady. He was working to keep it steady. Drift on the roof. I tried to clear it from inside, couldn't reach. The wood is gone. Ruth's voice from behind Catherine. We burned the last of the indoor stack yesterday afternoon. The outdoor pile is under 8 feet of snow, and the door won't open enough to dig. Catherine looked at Henry. Can you walk? I can walk. Then we're going now. The cave is 20 minutes in normal conditions. Today it will take longer. Dress in everything you have. Henry did not move immediately. He looked at her and she watched him work through whatever internal negotiation was required. Watch the thing that was pride, or something older and more structural than pride, doing battle with the simple arithmetic of survival. She did not push him. She had learned enough about Henry Hayes to understand that pushing would cost more time than waiting. We cannot accept charity from you. He said it not cruelly, almost formally, as though he were citing a clause in a document they had both agreed to. Catherine looked at him directly. She did not raise her voice. Henry Thomas loved you. I know that because he talked about you in the nights when he was dying, not with anger, not with complaint, just with the plain love of a son who learned what he knew from his father. She paused. If you die in this house because you could not accept help from me, Thomas will not forgive you for it, and you know that's true. The room was very quiet. The coals ticked softly in the hearth. Henry stood up. It cost him something visible. His knees, the elevation, the blankets falling away from his lap. All of it took longer than it would have taken 6 months ago, and he did not look at her while he did it, but he stood. Ruth, get your coat, and that was the end of the negotiation. The walk back up the hill took nearly 2 hours. Catherine went first, driving the mattock handle through the snow, before each step in the uncertain sections, reading the slope beneath the white surface the way she had learned to read it over the past 3 months. Henry came behind her and Ruth behind him, one hand on his arm, not because she needed the support, but because she was providing it. The 3 of them moved up the hill in a line through the cold, bright morning with no conversation, because all their breath was needed for the work of moving. When they came over the last rise and the cave entrance appeared before them, the fire Catherine had banked before leaving, still producing a thin thread of smoke from the hearthstones, and the wall standing solid as it had stood since October. Henry stopped. He stood in the snow and looked at what Catherine had built. Not quickly, not with the evaluating glance of a man checking his assumptions. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that has required them to revise a belief they held for a long time slowly, and with a kind of attention that is also a form of admission. Then he stepped forward and put his hand on the log wall. Catherine watched him feel the warmth that had collected in the wood, the residual heat from 3 days of banked fire radiating outward through the chinking. She watched his hand press flat against the logs and stay there. She said nothing because some moments require no commentary. Ruth walked past both of them and through the doorway. Catherine heard her stop just inside. "Come in." Henry came in. The cave was 60 degrees. After the outside cold and the failing cold of the farmhouse, 60 degrees landed differently than it would have on an ordinary day. It was not the dramatic warmth of a roaring fire, but something better. Something that did not diminish as you moved away from a single source. Something that existed equally at the entrance and at the back wall and in the air above and against the floor below. Henry and Ruth stood in it, and Catherine watched it reach them. Watch their shoulders come down from around their ears. Watch their breathing change from the shallow, economical breathing of people conserving heat to something slower and more complete. Ruth put her hand on the limestone wall and held it there. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Catherine got the fire outside built up properly, then came back in and began heating broth from the stores she had put up in the autumn, dried beans reconstituted and seasoned with what the hillside had offered before the cold took it. She worked at the small cooking arrangement she had built near the entrance and did not make conversation, because what Henry and Ruth needed in that first hour was not conversation, but warmth and silence, and the gradual return of the body's confidence in its own continuation. They ate, all three of them, sitting on the flat stones Catherine had arranged as seating near the entrance, eating bean broth from the 3 tin cups she owned. The food was plain and the situation was not what any of them would have designed, and nobody said anything false about it. On the fourth night, Catherine woke in the dark and heard Ruth crying. It was not loud. It was the kind of crying that has been held back for a long time and moves through a person quietly, because the habit of containment is stronger than the feeling, the way a river moves differently underground than it does in open air. Catherine lay still and listened and did not pretend to be asleep, but she did not speak either. Some things need to happen without an audience, even when an audience is present. In the morning, Ruth was herself again, meaning the composed and careful version of herself, the version with the straight back and the measured speech. But something had shifted at a level below expression, below the surface architecture of the face she showed the world. Catherine could see it. She did not know yet what to do with it. They fell into a pattern over the following days, the three of them occupying the cave in a kind of careful coexistence that required constant small negotiations about space and routine, and the unspoken hierarchies that operate even in situations where survival has temporarily suspended the usual rules. Henry sat near the entrance most mornings looking out at the White Valley when the weather allowed visibility. Ruth worked at the small task Catherine gave her mending and sorting and organizing stores, her hands needing occupation the way some people's minds need distraction. Catherine managed the fire and the food and the general maintenance of their continued existence. And all three of them were careful not to acknowledge directly that the arrangement they were in inverted every assumption about obligation and debt that had structured their relationship for the past 8 months. On the 8th day, Henry and Catherine were sitting at the cave entrance in the early morning, while Ruth slept looking out at the White Valley below, where the snow was beginning to show the faint blue shadows that meant it was starting very slowly to reconsider its position. I knew the cave wasn't worthless. Catherine turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her. His hands were resting on his knees and his beard needed attention, and he looked for the first time since Catherine had known him like a man rather than a position, like someone who had arrived at a moment through a long chain of choices and was finally looking at the chain clearly enough to see where it had bent. Elijah Stone came to see us the winter we arrived here. 30 years ago, he came to every new family that first year, those of us who were green enough to need it. He told us about the valley, the water, the soil which hollows flooded in spring, which hillsides held heat longer into autumn. He paused. He told me about the caves on that eastern slope. He told me about the one you're living in. He described what it could do. Catherine said nothing. She waited. When I gave it to you, I wanted you gone. I want you to understand that I am not pretending otherwise. I wanted you to leave and stop being a reminder of what we lost. He looked at his hands. But I could not give you something that would kill you outright. I could not do that to Thomas's memory, and I could not do it to myself, whatever else I am. His jaw moved. The cave was the best I could offer without losing the face I needed to keep. I thought you would try for a week and then go. I did not think you were the kind of woman who would actually do what you did. The morning was very quiet around them. The snow on the hillside had the particular stillness of things that are about to change. I was wrong about what kind of woman you are. I was wrong about many things. I am telling you this because Thomas would want me to, and because at 68 years old in a cave that a 25-year-old woman built from a hole in the ground, I find I have less patience than I once did for continuing to be wrong about things I could correct. Catherine looked at the valley for a while. She thought about all the mornings she had come down the slope and looked at the farmhouse below and felt the complicated weight of existing in a place that was not fully willing to receive her. She thought about Thomas writing letters that asked about soil drainage. She thought about Elijah pressing his mark into the limestone in 1816, 40 years before she had done the same. Thank you for not giving me something that would kill me outright. Henry looked at her quickly. It was not what he had expected her to say. And then, for the first and only time in Catherine's experience of him, one corner of his mouth moved upward by a fraction. Not a smile exactly, but the muscular memory of one, and it changed his face entirely for just a moment, showed her the man Thomas had grown up loving. You are a difficult woman to have been wrong about. I've been told. 2 days later, when the sun had worked on the snow long enough that the valley roads were passable for a determined person, Reverend Whitmore came up the hill. He did not come alone. Ben Carter was behind him, carrying a bundle of firewood on his shoulder. Not a courtesy bundle, but a serious load, the kind you carry when you mean business. Behind Ben were two other men from the valley. Farmers Catherine recognized by sight but not by name, and they were carrying food and more wood, and the general purposeful energy of people who have decided that a situation requires action. Margaret Finn came too. Catherine did not know why, whether curiosity or guilt, or the social calculation of a woman who understands when a position has become untenable. She came last up the slope, and she stood at the back of the group when they assembled outside the cave entrance. Henry came out. He was steadier than he had been 8 days ago. The cave and Catherine's food, and the simple fact of not dying, had restored something to him. Not the full force of the man he had been at 50, but something workable, something that stood straight and looked out at the gathering of his neighbors with clear eyes. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Catherine Hayes walked a mile through 8 feet of snow to bring Ruth and me out of a house that was killing us. She fed us from stores. She built herself from a cave. She built herself from a hillside that I gave her because I expected it to defeat her. He looked at the group, and his gaze moved to Margaret Finn, stayed there for a moment before moving on. Anyone in this valley who has something to say about this woman should have said it to me 8 months ago, because that is when it would have mattered. Now it does not matter at all because she has already proven everything that needed proving. The morning air held all of it. Margaret Finn looked at the ground. The two farmers whose names Catherine did not know looked at Henry and then at Catherine and nodded the simple nod of people acknowledging a fact. Ben Carter set down his bundle of firewood, walked through the group to the cave entrance, and carried it inside without asking permission, the way you carry wood into a neighbor's house when you know you should have been doing it all along. Whitmore came to stand beside Catherine. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the cave, at the wall, at the hearthstones, at Henry still standing in front of the gathered valley with the bearing of a man who has just done something that cost him and does not regret the cost. Thomas was right about you. He said you would look at a place honestly before deciding whether to love it. I think he meant more than places. He usually did. On the day before Henry and Ruth returned to the farmhouse, Ruth came to stand beside Catherine at the cave entrance in the late morning. The valley below was showing its bones again through the retreating snow, the dark lines of fences and the bare geometry of the orchards, the familiar shapes of a landscape reasserting itself after the interruption. Ruth stood with her hands folded in front of her looking at it. Catherine stood beside her and waited because she had learned over the past 2 weeks that Ruth arrived at the things she needed to say by a route that could not be rushed. I was wrong about you from the beginning. Not wrong in a simple way, wrong deliberately. I needed you to be inadequate because if you were adequate, I had to ask why I hadn't seen it sooner and why Thomas had to die for me to learn anything about the woman he chose. She stopped, breathed. I gave you this cave because I wanted you to fail. I want you to know that I know that. I want you to know that I have known it for some time and have continued doing it anyway, and I am not offering that as an excuse but as an accounting. I know you know. Ruth's voice had something in it that required effort to produce. You saved the lives of two people who were unkind to you in every way they could manage. You did it without condition and without making us feel the weight of what we owed you while you were doing it. She paused again. Thomas would be proud of you. He would be proud in the particular way he was proud of things quietly and for a long time without making a display of it. Catherine felt something move in her chest, not grief, excitedly, though grief was part of it. It was closer to the feeling of a door opening that you had stopped expecting to open, the particular quality of surprise that arrives when something you had written off as permanently closed turns out to have been only latched. Thomas would be proud of you too, for coming here, for staying, for saying this. Ruth looked at her. For the first time, the look was direct and unguarded without the filtering mechanism that had been in place since the dock in Philadelphia, when two women who loved the same man met each other across his coffin before they had ever met across a table. It lasted only a moment, that look, but it was the real thing. I would like you to come to dinner on Sunday, when the roads are clear and the chimney is repaired. I would like you to come and sit at the table properly. A pause. As family, I'll come. Henry and Ruth walked back down the hill the following morning slowly and carefully on the packed snow of the path that Catherine had cleared and re-cleared over 2 weeks. Catherine watched them from the cave entrance, Henry's broad back and Ruth's steel gray hair, the two of them moving together down the slope with the deliberate care of people who have been reminded that the ground beneath them requires attention. They did not look back, but this time, Catherine understood it was different from the last time they had walked away from her without looking back. The first time they had walked away from someone they wanted to forget. This time they were walking towards something they were still figuring out how to want. She watched them until the tree line took them. Then she turned and went back to her work. The winter continued its slow release of the valley through February and into March. Catherine went down to the Hayes farmhouse for Sunday dinner and found herself seated at the head of the table, the place where Thomas had sat when he was alive. And nobody remarked on this, but everyone noticed it. The meals became routine each Sunday, adding another stone to a foundation that might eventually support something like family. In March, Catherine went up to Elijah's cabin and found it exactly as she had left it weeks before, the door wedged shut, the interior cold and still. She brought tools and dug his grave in the softening earth beside the cabin, working for 2 days to break through the frost line and get down to soil that would hold. Reverend Whitmore came up when she sent word through Ben Carter, and he stood beside her and spoke the words over Elijah Stone's grave that the living need to say over the dead for their own reasons as much as the dead person's. Catherine set the stone she had chosen at the head of the grave, flat and large enough to receive the words she had cut into it with a borrowed chisel. He taught me that the earth does not care what the weather does above. She stood at the grave for a moment with Whitmore beside her, and the April hillside running green around them, and thought about the shape of a life that had ended here. A man who had come with nothing and learned everything and left knowledge buried in the ground and carved in stone and drawn on folded leather for whoever came after him. A man who had spent 36 years waiting for the right person to find what he had prepared and who had lived long enough to watch her use it. That seemed to her like a life that had accomplished what it set out to do. She lived in the cave for 3 more years. Henry Hayes began coming up the hill in the spring of 1858, occasionally on Sunday afternoons, when the farm work allowed it appearing at the cave entrance with something practical in his hands: a length of rope, a spare axe handle, a jar of beeswax. He never stayed long, but he kept coming. In the summer of 1859, Henry came up on a Sunday afternoon and told her there was someone he wanted her to meet. James Porter was 40 years old, a widower with 3 children and a farm on the north side of the valley, that he had worked alone for 2 years since his wife died in childbirth. He had the hands of someone who worked in all weathers and the eyes of someone who had been through enough to stop pretending things were simpler than they were. Catherine and James met through the autumn, ticking with the honest, practical thoroughness of 2 people who have each already survived loss and know better than to be careless about what they choose next. They married in the spring of 1860. She moved into his farmhouse with the 3 children who were wary of her at first, and she gave them time and did not force anything. By the following winter, they were hers in the way that children become yours, not through biology, but through accumulated mornings. She kept the cave. James understood this without requiring an explanation. She used it for root storage, for shelter during bad storms, for the particular quality of silence it offered in the busy life of a farm, with children and all the continuous demands of a world that does not pause. She brought the children up to it on a Saturday morning, sometimes all 5 of them, including the baby born in 1861, and she showed them the hearthstones and the wall and the carved initials, EAS 1816, deep in the limestone, and she told them the story, the way stories are meant to be told, not as history, but as something that is still alive and still asking something of the people who hear it. Henry Hayes died in December of 1862, peacefully in the house he had built 30 years before, with Ruth beside him and Catherine in the room. On his last clear day, he asked Catherine to sit beside him, and she did. And he looked at her for a while without speaking. The cave. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I'll keep it, I promised you." He nodded. Then not just the land, the story. The story is the part that matters. She kept both. The land passed through generations, used as a root cellar and storm shelter, through 4 generations of Hayes and Porter descendants who did not always know why they kept it, but felt in the vague way that inherited things are felt, that letting it go would be losing something they could not replace. The entrance collapsed in 1923, a small landslide following 3 days of spring rain, and no one cleared it, because by then the particular knowledge of what the cave had done and why it mattered had thinned to a kind of general family legend. The details softened by retelling into something warmer and less specific than what actually happened. But the actual thing did happen. A 25-year-old woman from New York State stood at the mouth of a cave in October of 1856 with a cooking pot and a bundle of clothes and a question she could not yet answer. And instead of turning around, she felt what the earth was offering and decided it was enough to work with. She built a wall and a hearth and a life from materials that had been given to her as an insult, and she survived a winter that nearly killed the people who had provided those materials, and then she went and got them out of the house that was killing them and brought them home to the place that was warm. She did not do it to prove something. She did not do it to win. She did it because the earth was warm and the wall was solid and the fire was burning and there were people a mile away who were running out of time, and she was the only one who knew it and who was capable of getting to them. That is not a complicated story. The most important ones never are. What is worthless depends entirely on who is looking at it and what they are willing to learn. A hole in the ground is a hole in the ground until someone asks why it stays warm in January and goes looking for the answer and has the patience to let the answer change what they do next. Catherine Hayes pressed her hand against that stone in the autumn of 1856 and did not let go. That is why she lived. That is why they all lived. That is the whole of it.